All right, welcome everyone. This is Trinity Lutheran Church with our Bible study online as we continue going through serving in God's mission and looking at the ideas and biblical concepts behind some strategic planning topics. Today we'll be focusing on Lesson 5, which you can find on the website, and it's Strategic Planning as a First Article Gift, prioritizes use of limited resources. Okay? With that, though, let us go ahead and open in prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank and praise you that you have sent us this amazing gift of proclaiming your word to the world around us. Help us to use your gifts in the wisest way possible, to be smart and dedicated in our efforts, but most of all, Lord, to give all glory and honor to you. In your name we pray. Amen. Amen. Okay. So as I said, we'll be working on the lesson number 5, strategic planning as a first article gift. And the lesson starts off in Psalm 24, where they're trying to make a point. Psalm 24 verses 1 and 2 reads, "The earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof, the world and those who dwell therein. For he has founded it upon the seas and established it upon the rivers." And so Psalm 24 reminds us that God has and controls unlimited resources. Everything that has ever been created belongs to the Lord. And then Psalm 50 reinforces this by, in verse 10 and 12, saying, "For every beast of the forest is mine, the cattle on 1,000 hills. I know all the birds of the hills, and all that moves in the field is mine. If I were hungry, I would not tell you, for the world and its fullness are mine." So the point being that God has unlimited resources, but every congregation has limited resources. The Lord could very well provide an abundance of every kind of resource of everyone to every one of his congregations, but he chooses not to do this. Instead, he gives different gifts to different congregations according to his will. The parable of the talents found in Matthew 25 is a familiar parable to many of us. However, we tend to focus on how the parable ends and often overlook an important aspect in how it begins. The parable starts with the owner of the property entrusting his money to different servants in different amounts, each according to his ability. Okay, so we're going to read through the whole parable. We're not going to just do the 2 verses that they've got in the lesson guide. We're going to do Matthew 25, verse 14 through 30. Okay? It's Matthew 25, verse 14 through 30. I guess, though, before I start into that, does anyone have any comments or questions about the things that we've talked about in the Psalms? Okay? Well, let's go into Matthew then. So in Matthew 25, 14 through 30, it says, "For it'll be like a man going on a journey who called his servants and entrusted to them his property." A little back up a little bit. This parable by Jesus takes place as part of his larger speech about what the end times will be like. Okay? And so the disciples asked Jesus, when will these things happen and what will be the sign of the times? And so Jesus goes through a pretty long discourse about the different signs of the times. And so this parable is one of those signs, okay? And so back to verse 15, it says, "To one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, to another 1, to each according to his ability. Then he went away. He who had received the 5 talents went at once and traded with them and made 5 talents more. So also he who had the 2 talents made 2 talents more. But he who had received the 1 talent went and dug in the ground and hid his master's money. Now after a long time the master of those servants came and settled accounts with them. And he who had received the 5 talents came forward, bringing 5 talents more, saying, Master, you delivered to me 5 talents. Here, I have made 5 talents more. His master said to him, Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful over a little. I will set you over much. Enter into the joy of your master. And he also, who had the 2 talents, came forward, saying, Master, you delivered to me 2 talents. Here, I have made 2 talents more. His master said to him, Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful over a little. I will set you over much. Enter into the joy of your master. He also, who had received the 1 talent, came forward, saying, Master, I knew you to be a hard man, reaping where you did not sow, and gathering where you scattered no seed. So I was afraid, and I went and hid your talent in the ground. Here, you have what is yours. But his master answered him, You wicked and slothful servant. You knew that I reap where I have not sown, and gather where I scattered no seed. Then you ought to have invested my money with the bankers, and at my coming I should have received what was my own with interest. So take the talent from him, and give it to him who has the 10 talents. For to everyone who has more will be given, and he will have an abundance. But from the one who has not, even what he has will be taken away. And cast the worthless servant into the outer darkness. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Any thoughts?
You know, this story always bothered me a little bit. The master gave the talents, and then he got them back, the money, and he got them back. And it always bothered me that the one fella didn't invest it. I mean, he put it in the ground and didn't get much, and obviously, at least he gave it back. He didn't trust the bankers, apparently, and at that time there was no FDIC, so, you know, there's a risk of putting it in the bank. There's also a risk of putting it in the ground. You might lose it or forget where it is or something. But it seemed to me like the master was unjustly harsh with that fella. But I'm not the master, and it's not right for me to second-guess Jesus also. So I was just wondering why he did that.
Okay. So one thing with parables, you know, a way to understand them is, right, they're an earthly story with a heavenly meaning. And so let's try to pick out some of the heavenly meanings in this story. One way to do that is to try to identify characters in the story with characters in, in God or in us. So let's do some of the characters. The master. In this parable, who do you think the master could represent?
God.
I heard Bruce say God. Yeah. Okay. Any other ideas? I like the idea of God, and I think that's a good one, but I don't know.
In the context here, where the context is in the last days, which we're in right now, one would surely think that the master is God.
Uh-huh. And specifically God at Judgment Day, right?
Yes.
Yeah. What about the other people? What about the servants?
Well, needless to say, he was talking to people there, so I'm sure those servants are representatives of people like us and like them.
Okay. So
and like us, the servants had various levels of talents. Some people were probably good at one thing and some good at another, and so it mentioned that he gave the money to them in accordance with his judgment of their talents.
Yeah, according to their abilities.
Their skills. Yeah, abilities, sorry.
Yeah. So, who did the talents belong to?
To the master.
To the master, yeah. Or in this case, if we're taking it from a proverbial sense, or parable sense to God, right? Okay. And he gives them, different amounts based upon their ability. But then what does he expect them to do with those?
Put them to use.
Put them to use, yeah. As the final, the servant who had 1 talent, as he puts it, verse 24. I knew that you to be a hard man, reaping where you did not sow, and gathering where you scattered no seed. In other words, the guy knew that this master was going to expect something from him, and he didn't want to risk losing what the master had given him, right? Which is why in verse 26, he says, you wicked and slothful servant, you knew that I reap where I have not sown and gather where I have scattered no seed. Then you ought to have invested my money, right? And so the expectation was understood, but unfortunately the servant who was only given 1 talent was more fearful of failure than he was fearful well, not fearful of failure, but he was afraid that he wouldn't succeed, and so he wanted to make sure he didn't fail. I guess that's the way of putting it, right?
He was kind of disrespectful of his master, though, too, and didn't think much of him, apparently, because he had nerve to say those things to him.
Yeah.
Well, I kind of disagree with that the master was that way. The servant said the master was that way. And what the master said was, so you knew that I was, with a question mark. So the master wasn't necessarily that way. He was, but that's the way the servant felt he was.
Okay.
So there's a problem right there,
So we've already got, maybe a misconception between the servant and the master and expectations and things like that. The master could consider himself being very generous, having just given this servant a talent, right?
That's right. I mean, he gave one 5 talents and another 2, or 10, whatever it was. But anyway, a lot of money, because the talent was worth over, many thousands of dollars. And so that particular servant wasn't really too trustful of his master. He didn't think too much of it, So I think the failing was with the servant, not the master so much. The master didn't say that he was. He said, so you do, basically he's saying, this is what you thought of me.
Okay. So what do you think, Dave? You were saying that you were kind of concerned by the way this situation played out. What would you say to what Bruce just said?
Well, it seems to me, first off, the master never did tell his servants what to do. There was an expectation, we think, that you were supposed to invest the money, you were supposed to use it for some good purpose. But he really didn't call them together and said, now, fellas, I'm going to give you a bunch of money, and I expect you to do good things with that. I expect you to make an investment and get a return. And whenever I come back, I want to see something for it. He didn't do that. And I don't know that he needed to. Maybe that was an expectation. I hope so. Apparently, that's what the world would think, I guess. And that's what the story has left to our imagination, is that, yep, you ought to probably do something with this. And I understand where the master was able to call the guy that only got 1 and only returned nothing on top of it. I understand where he told that servant, you're a lazy fella. You didn't do anything. You dug a hole. That took a little effort, but not much. And that's it. That's all you did. You dug a hole and sat back and did nothing. He didn't enjoy the money. He didn't steal it. He didn't use it. He didn't do anything with it. So he didn't break any rules. No rules were really given. On the other hand, you would think, and everybody in the world that's a normal person probably would think, gosh, I better do something with this. That's a lot of money. It's over $1,000. I should probably do something. I don't know. It's just wild thoughts.
So I guess the question comes to that verse 14. For it'll be like a man going on a journey who called his servants and entrusted to them his property. Okay, I think the concept there is entrusting to them his property. So what is that? I guess that's the question: is what does that imply, or what does that mean, or what's understood behind that? Yeah.
So is this kind of along the lines? Is this kind of along the lines of how we've all been given gifts, and we are expected to use the gifts that we have been given, and it falls along the same mindset of the whole faith without works is dead. So we should want to go out and use gifts we're given to the glory of God to show His love to the world. And if we don't, if we just bury it, like he buried his talent instead of trying to increase it, then we're just being lazy and your faith just slowly withers and dies, kind of thought.
Yeah, I think that's correct. And I think what Bruce was saying is also correct. And Dave, I don't think you're necessarily wrong, but I think you are kind of missing one aspect of it. This was not given to them for it to be their property. It was the master's property, and it was entrusted to them, so they were stewards of that property. And as a steward is supposed to take care of the property according to the will of the owner, right?
Well, yeah, I agree with all that, but consider another example from today's world. Let's pretend that your neighbor decides to take a trip to Europe and it'll take him 6 months. And he says, hey, would you take care of my house? Sure. Then why don't you feed the cat and, water the plants and stuff and make sure that everything's fine. So the person that was asked says, sure, I'll take care of that, no problem. That person did not, probably wouldn't, make arrangements with a rental agency and see if he could find somebody to rent the house for 6 months and then give all the proceeds to the person who was in Europe enjoying his vacation for 6 months. You wouldn't do that. You would do what you were asked to do. You would feed the cat. You would take care of the plants, normal things. You're entrusted with the property. You have the keys. You can do pretty much what you want to. And so you don't do anything, but you did certainly take care of it. And if the water line broke in front of your house, you would get it fixed. And if it got kind of dusty, you might even mow the lawn and dust the place a little bit, and especially just before the guy came back. And, yep, everything's fine. Your house is fine. See ya. And everything's good.
Yeah, I think the difference is for, like, the person who's given the one talent, it's like he was entrusted with taking care of the house. But his way of taking the house was just making sure that no one broke into the house or did anything, but he did not mow the lawn. He did not clean it at all. He would have, yes, gone and fed the animals, but not really brushed them or cleaned up after them or anything. So in my mind, it's a difference between him just saying, well, yes, your animals were fed, but I didn't pick up after your animals. And yes, the house is still standing, but I didn't do anything to maintain it. Versus what you said, where someone would go and say, okay, I am in charge of taking care of these animals and making sure this house is okay. And you would do things like mow the lawn if it needed it, or water the grass, or make sure the animals have water and food, and probably clean up after them too if that's what you were charged with. So I think that's the difference, is he was probably doing the bare minimum he could and still uphold what his master wanted, versus doing what kind of common sense would dictate and say, well, I should probably also do this since I am doing this one aspect of it too.
Yeah.
Okay, I can see that. That's a good point.
But we're
second-guessing too. Go ahead, John.
We're second-guessing here about what kind of instructions were implied and not specifically stated in all that. And we can draw lots of conclusions about that. But there's another scenario to think about. The first servant was deferential to his master and said, here's what I got managed for you. It's yours. Thank you. And so did the second one. But the third servant lipped off to him from the beginning and was a smart aleck and accused him of things that probably weren't true to justify his laziness. Maybe he would have been treated in a manner that we would consider more fair if he hadn't been such a smart aleck.
I suppose that is possible. At least recognizing, the limitations and things like that. I think if we want to use the analogy of the house, the house sitting, then I think just taking care of the house and returning the house to the owner the way it was given to you would be the 1-talent servant. But a 2-talent servant would be someone who notices that, oh, when I was given this house, the drain pipe on this one side was kind of broken, and so I took the time to fix it and improve that. Or a 5-talent servant might be, wow, I realized that the curb appeal of this house is really bad, and so I did this kind of major landscaping and made it look really good and really nice, and I did it according to what I already know the master would approve and appreciate. Hence, being a steward, assumes that you have an understanding of your master. So the point, though, of the parable is twofold. One, people were given things according to their ability. The master, in knowledge of the abilities of his servants, gave the more able servant more money and the less able servant less money. And then the other part was, how did the servants use those talents, and which one was rewarded and which one was punished? And so, thinking of this as end times, God has given us his creation, stewardship of the aspects of his creation. And so how have we been doing in our stewardship? The ones that he's given lots, have we been entrusting and treating that as someone who has the ability and the competence to do that well? Or have we, as those who have been given little, have we been doing as much as we can with what we've been given? So going back to the lesson then, it says each congregation, take this now from individual level now to congregational level, each congregation has been entrusted with God's property, each according to its ability. How does the Lord know the ability of each congregation? Well, like a potter who shapes clay, like it says in Romans 9:20 and 21, he is the one who shaped and fashioned each congregation according to his purpose for it. For God's design, every congregation has been provided with a set amount of resources. Some congregations are 1-talent congregations, and some are 2-talent congregations, and others are 5-talent congregations. Because resources are not unlimited, every congregation faces limitations at one time, money, people, etc. Without a clear purpose and focus, there's bound to be conflict in the congregation over how to use these limited resources, or how these resources should be used. Strategic planning provides a means to minimize that conflict. And so, which leads us to the first question then in our lesson. What does everything in all of creation, why does everything in all creation belong to the Lord? And what does everything include? Okay, so backing away from the parable and now going to a little more general understanding of creation. Why does everything in all creation belong to the Lord?
He's the creator.
Because he created it, right? Yeah. It's kind of pretty straightforward. The creator owns his own creation, right? If you were to paint a picture, you would own the picture you painted, right? Okay? What does everything include?
Everything.
Everything, yeah. House, home, land, animals, wife, children. Start listing off Luther's little list, right?
It's like that joke, Luke, where the scientists were telling God, "We don't need you anymore. We figured out how to create man ourselves out of dirt." And God says, "Okay, show me." And they start. And he goes, "Oh wait, no. You get your own dirt because he made it all. That's all his. It doesn't matter what we use. He made it first." So.
Yeah. Oh, and recognizing the fact that in all of that, he gave all of this to us to use according to his purpose, right? So maybe a little more specifically, what of the everything is given to us in our congregation? So what have we been given, in turn of out of this everything? What have we been given specifically in our congregation?
A building.
The building, okay.
People.
Yeah. Even specifically within the people.
Where we are.
Say that again, John?
We've also been given the community where we are and the people who are in it and the circumstances of it. We didn't make that. Given to us.
Correct. Yeah. And we've been given organists, and we've been given elders, and we've been given volunteers and quilters, and we've been given money. We've been given a preschool. What else?
Well, we've been given our attitudes and our learning and, the other stuff that we bring to the table.
Our personalities and our backgrounds.
Yeah.
Yeah. Our skill sets. We've got some within the congregation that are skilled in, technology, like Char and Wayne, and we've got some, in the congregation who are skilled with kind of that less technological personal touch, like I think Barbara Jean helps by printing some of the newsletters, and I'm trying to remember.
He also delivers the mail for the church and the preschool, like distributes the mail.
Oh, Barbara Jean, especially
does.
on the days where I'm not here or the preschool's not there, yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. And so we've been given, these things. But the next question, though, goes into limits, okay? For what purpose does God limit the resources available to a congregation? Why limit us? If he's God Almighty, creator of everything, why doesn't he just unlimited give us everything to fulfill his purpose and his will? Why does God limit the resources available to a congregation?
What if we went...
Oh, that's one at a time. Char, why don't you go first? I think I heard you first.
We might not depend on him.
We might not depend on him. We might take for granted the things he's given us. Okay. And then John?
We might look back at that parable and see that master gave out his stuff according to the ability of his servants, and so maybe God portions out the gifts to his congregations according to their ability, so that they're not faced with an overwhelming task they can't handle, but they have one that they can handle and the resources they need for it.
Oh, that's a very insightful answer there too. Yeah, because he doesn't want us to give us more than we can handle. Yeah, that's a good answer.
One of the other things in everything that God has given us is that he knows already, since he made us and we belong to him, as he made us, he knows our shortcomings. One of the worst things, as I understand it, from a financial standpoint, one of the worst things that could happen to a person is to win the lottery. You end up blowing it all and losing it and all that stuff, and he obviously knows how we would react if he gave us all the wealth and riches of the universe and gave it to one congregation or all congregations and said, here, go for it. I've given you every tool there ever was. Go for it. What would we end up doing that because of our sinful nature and our human weakness and all that stuff?
Yeah. Yeah, that's very true. You know, back to the whole idea of giving us according to our ability. Well, that could be a curse to give us beyond our ability, because then we could actually end up worse off than where we started, right? Yeah. I think one thing, too, that I was thinking of when I was looking at this, when I was preparing for this lesson, is it's often harder to excel when you have no incentive or no challenge, right? When you're challenged and you're incentivized, you know, to do the most you can with as little as you can, that often breeds the most innovative solutions. I believe the saying is, necessity is the mother of invention. And so by constraining congregation, God's actually encouraging us to use the creativity he's given us to fulfill the very mission that he's asked us to fulfill. Yeah. Any other thoughts about why God, or for what purpose God limits the resources available to a congregation? Okay, so kind of carrying on that theme then, specific to us and our congregation and our context, what resource limitations does our congregation face? Age, okay. We have a lot of older members and not a lot of younger members, okay. So in terms of a limit, we don't have a lot of those young people.
Small size.
A small size. We don't have the large, diverse resources to do all these different things. A good example of a good contrary example to this is the church where Hope grew up, Emmanuel and St. Charles. They are such a large congregation that they're doing more things than they even realize they're doing half the time, because they've got so many people to throw at all sorts of different activities that they don't have to really worry about running out of people at times and just having an overwhelming number of activities for the number of people they have.
I think there's a temptation in questions like this, though, and you spoke of Emmanuel St. Charles, Missouri, which I know about too. We could pretty soon become covetous and say, well, we ought to have this. They got it. Why don't we have it? What's wrong with this master? How is he doing? And there is a point that points at our limitations, and I think we got to go back to the parable there too. That third servant that got treated so unfairly, he didn't regard his master the way he should have, and so we have to be careful when we talk about our master and parceling out these resources. In the end, it's going to turn out that we have exactly the resources we need to do what he wants us to do here, not one speck more nor less. And if we're all old geezers, that's what he wants here, and he has a job for us. And if Emmanuel has 6,000 young people, they have a different task, and that's what he expects of them. So we should look at this, and we should know what our resources are, but we should be careful, I believe, that we don't become covetous.
Yeah. Well, and one of the things...
On the same line, it's important to remember that they also have their restrictions, and part of that is due to being such a large size. So there are benefits to being a smaller congregation. There are benefits to being a larger congregation, and you just have to seek out what those benefits are and be aware of what your limitations are so that you know best how to handle the situations that you are given.
Yeah. I think one of Go ahead, Dave.
That's another way to look at it. We were talking about people with resources, and then we start talking about the limitations of our resources. And I wonder if that's part of human nature creeping in right there. At the very beginning, we say, well, we're limited by being small, and we don't have much money, and, we're not in big of a metropolitan area, and all these things that are kind of negative. Lack of resources, when in fact, maybe we ought to be looking at our resources as gifts from God, as a free gift that he says, here, I'm going on a trip, use some of this stuff. He didn't give us all, each one of those servants got according to their need. And I wonder about that last servant, the one, if he had a meeting and all three of those servants came by and said, I got a bunch, I got 5, and I got 2. Well, that puts that guy on the defensive. So he says, well, I didn't make anything, but I got your one. Maybe that's why he was making some excuses, in that it became obvious at the very end, wow, I didn't do what those other fellows did. Those guys are shining stars, and I'm just barely glimmering here. And maybe that put him a little bit on the defensive too. And so if we look at ourselves by having what we don't have, maybe that's the beginning of those limitations. And look at what you do have and avoid looking at what you don't have.
I think part of the idea in looking at our limitations is to recognize what we do and what we don't, because sometimes you can focus too heavily on one or the other. And I think by using both, by seeing what you don't have, then you can also, compare that to what you do have to be able to, use what you have and what you don't have to the glory of God. As you guys have pointed out, we don't have a lot of young members, but we have a lot of old members. Well, wisdom comes with age, right? Which means we have a congregation who can wisely decide, how to do things and how to move forward, as opposed to an incredibly young congregation who is very often unwise in the use of their resources, right? And so, once again, not just because it's a limit doesn't mean it's necessarily a bad thing. Because it's a limit, it's a way of us looking at how God is directing us towards his will and his purpose. Okay? So I think you guys are all on the right track here. I think we're all, going, young families versus old. I think John mentioned a little bit about, Dave and John mentioned, we aren't in some major metropolitan with all this, growth and everything like that, and that's fine. That's a limit, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. We're in an established community. We're in a community that isn't dying. We're in a community that, isn't growing by leaps and bounds, but at the same time, we're in the community where God has put us. And so it's, a limit, but at the same time, it's a direction that we can work with. Another kind of limit, we don't have infinite money, but on the flip side, we are financially what's the word I'm looking for? Financially stable. There we go. We are stable, right?
Stable, yeah.
Yeah. Another limit, we don't have, as John pointed out earlier, we don't have a ton of workers to be able to do everything, or a ton of volunteers, but we do have the ones we have. What other kind of limits do we face?
One of the things we face is faced, of course, by every Christian, and that's the sword that he came to bring, because there's opposition from people who are afraid, as you said in a sermon, of the gospel.
Yeah, you were paying attention. We don't only come to bring peace, but also a sword, and so there is division because of that sword. Yeah. And with that can be difficult for our community engagement at times, because we aren't always politically correct, right? Okay. Any other ideas on this question before we move on to the next question? Okay. So the next question is, in what things, so thinking of our limits and in our benefit, or our gifts, in what things are we a one-talent congregation, a two-talent congregation, and a five-talent congregation? So kind of looking less at our limits now and more at our abilities. So where do our abilities lie? More of kind of the one-talent thing where, yeah, we've got a little ability in this area, but not a large ability in this area. What do you think? What about the one talent? Or would it be easier to work from reverse? Maybe that would be easier.
Well, I was going to say, along the lines of, I don't know if I'd consider a one talent as per what the parable was, but an area where it's like we're limited in the area, and so we don't really have as great of a need to develop it yet, would be like the children's ministry side, because we don't have a whole lot of children right now, other than the ones apparently we keep bringing to the congregation. But it's something which would be nice to grow, but right now there are other areas that require a greater focus because there's actual need for it right now. But it's something we know that in the future we do need to address and work on. But it's not like the big item right now, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, I can see that.
But isn't the presence or absence of children, or the presence or absence in our congregation of old people, isn't that part of the talents we've been given to deal with what we have and do the best we can with them?
Yeah.
Yeah. And one way that I thought this was a little easier to understand is to think of it in terms of ability. You know, does our congregation have a good ability with children's ministry, or lack of an ability with children's ministry? And then if you want to go the opposite side of that coin, does our congregation have a good ability for older adult ministry, or a lack of ability for older adult ministry? How talented and able are we in those different areas?
I think we definitely have the talent in our congregation for a children's ministry. I mean, there are a lot of people who worked with young kids in the past. I mean, we had children's church going, so we do have the ability. It's just one of those, we lack the children, which I know is one of those, if we develop it, more families will come. But it's one of those that takes a lot of time and a lot of dedication. And do we have the time right now? And I don't. Well, I personally, I don't know. So.
Well, and when I went through this, I did put kind of the young families in our youth ministry as the one or the two talents, because it's not that we don't have the ability, but I wouldn't say our ability is as great as you know, a 5-talent congregation where they've got a huge ability in that area.
You know, there's another way to look at this.
Okay.
We are blessed with a lot of older type, senior type people, of which I'm perhaps one of them. And one way to look at that is to say, you know, most of those people have had children, and they know how to deal with children. Mm-hmm. And they may have different ideas about raising kids based on, you know, different generations that they've come from, but you can't say that we don't have experience on what to do with children when, in fact, almost everybody has a bunch of children and probably a bunch of grandchildren and all that kind of stuff. So
would you put it then in the 5-talent congregation category?
In some regards, yes. We have a lot of experience. We also have another advantage about an older person's ministry, if you look at it that way. One of the things about an older person's ministry is that those people have a lot of time because they're retired. They don't have kids at home anymore that keep them running around like crazy. They probably maybe don't have a job either. They're retired. They have an income from previous employment or whatever. So there are some advantages in having this senior sort of complement in our congregation. As you said, older people are generally supposed to, at least reputed to be wiser, and so that's helpful too.
Yeah, and I think some of that shows in some of the areas where we have excelled in as well. For example, fellowship within the church, has been an amazing thing for this congregation. As I've mentioned before, every single visitor who we've had show up for fellowship has come back. Well, I guess with the exception of one person who was traveling through town and would never be coming back. But the people who, live in the town and stay for fellowship, they come back. I think we've got an amazing ability there, and part of that is tied to the wisdom of the membership we have, right? I think another example of kind of the 5-talent side is we have a congregation that is very united united as a congregation. We don't have a lot of conflict. We don't have a lot of, dissent and bickering and backstabbing and things like that, which, from what I understand, has occurred in the past, but I wouldn't say it's a current thing within the congregation at all. What other things, and what other things can you guys think of, and how would you put them, or where would you put them in the 1 or 2 or 5 talent, side of things?
I think if you slice it really thin, it's going to turn out that we're a 5-talent congregation every place, because we have everything that we need to. We've been given everything we need. We have even all the people we need to do it. And they have the know-how which they've been given. It's all been given to us. It's none of our doing. So I think we're well poised. If fellowship, as you mentioned, is a big thing, of course it is. We know that. Maybe it's high time to restart that. Even if we have to have all sorts of restrictions, that might be worth doing.
Now, I would actually disagree with you a little bit on that, John, in terms of everything being a 5-talent. I don't think that we have, the 5 talents for certain areas of ministry. We don't have 5 talents in music even. We've got 5 talents in aspects of music maybe, but I wouldn't say that, we can go in any direction we want with our music. We have a very good skill set, but it's a very specific skill set with our musical abilities in the congregation. And so I don't think we can say we have 5 talents in everything.
I think preschool is at least a 2-talent. I think it's a long-term investment, and so even though we're not seeing a lot of immediate return as far as families who weren't part of our congregation before, who are in the preschool, coming into the congregation, and we haven't seen it. But I have had experience where someone who was in our preschool years ago, they go to another church, but they're going to a church, and they said, yeah, I first got into being a Christian because of chapel, at the preschool, because we had Bible studies or Bible stories at the preschool. So I think that's maybe a 2 talent. I don't know how many talents it is, but I think it's a very long-term investment, and it's an important investment in my view.
Well, and I like that idea, the idea of a long-term investment, because, well, what happens when you're a 2 talent, you're talking about a 2 talent area, and you return 2 talents on top of that? Well, when you take the next snapshot, now you're a 4 talent area, right?
Right.
And so it is a long-term investment, and in that regard, could we be a 5 talent, thing in every single area? I think, yeah, that's potential, but snapshot right now in time, I don't know that you could say that every single area is 5 or 2 or 1. I think each area is where it is now in time, and it's our task to then grow and use that according to what God's given us.
I think it's also important to remember it's not slighting the church or saying it's bad to say we have certain things that are in the other talent groups other than just the 5, because when you're looking at where you want to go and how you want to grow your church in the future, I think it is very important to know where you're not quite where you think you could be, so that you have a place to start and say, okay, this is something we know we want to develop, it's something we know we want to work on. How do we get there? Where do we go? And by just saying that, oh, we're good everywhere, then you're not looking at the places where other people are saying, no, I feel like we're struggling here. I know traditionally ministry to people, young adults, is one area that tends to get lost because they don't feel comfortable being with the older, wiser crowd yet because they don't feel like they fit that bill, and they don't feel comfortable being with the high schoolers anymore because they're not high schoolers either. And so it's just trying to find a way to address that. And I think everyone struggles with something, and it's just important to realize where you are and where you want to go and be able to address that honestly and say, okay, this is something we do need to work on and we need to go on. But we're doing it. I mean, we're still doing these things, and that's the important thing, is we're not just not doing it and pretending it doesn't exist. We are working on it, but we know we need to go a little further.
Yeah. I think that's the important thing. Is just saying that we're a 1, a 2, or a 5 in these different areas is not trying to paint a negative picture. It's not trying to be pessimistic or say we're failing or anything like that. No, it's recognizing the amazing gifts God has given to us. It's recognizing those gifts and then discussing how to use those gifts. So please don't take it as saying, oh, well, this is only 1. I'm not saying that that's a bad thing. I'm saying that that is where God has placed us, and as Hope has put it, that's an area that we can then grow and use that ability that God has given us. Yeah. Thoughts, John? Since I kind of contradicted, I'd love to hear your response.
Well, I think that the evaluation of our how many talent congregation we are is up to the master. That's what happened in the parable. He estimated his abilities of his servants, and he gave them things accordingly. So wherever we are, first of all, it's his doing. I mean, he knows.
Yeah.
And then also that guides his response as to how many talents he gives us to work with. So I think when we look at the resources in our congregation, our longcomings and our shortcomings, we've received those because that's what we can handle. And he knows that. We don't. We figure we can do better, and we can, of course, naturally. But in the end, we get exactly what we need. And that's what I meant when I said I think we're a 5-talent congregation, because he has given us all those talents that we need to do what we need to do here in his opinion, and I respect his opinion.
Yeah.
Whether we're like some other congregations, not all that important in that regard, because they don't have our circumstances, nor has he evaluated them the way he evaluated us? So I'm not trying to say that we're weak in something and strong in other things, and we can see those things. And as humans, we should be evaluating them. But what are we worthy of to receive from our Master is up to him, is what I was trying to.
Okay, yeah, no, I like that. Yeah, focusing on the idea that, once again, we are his creation. He has gifted us with what he wants us to be stewards of based upon what he knows we can handle, what he knows we can do with this. And, this parable encourages us to do the best we can, right? To not be a wicked and slothful servant, as it says in verse 26, but instead to, use what God has given us and to fulfill his mission. As I point out in the sermon, right? This is the mission incredible. It's an incredible mission because it's our amazing gift, and it's the whole reason that we're even here today, right? If we hadn't been put and placed in the places that God has placed us in, then we would be lost. We would not have Christ as our Savior. We would not have faith. We would not have belief and forgiveness. No, instead, it's incredible that despite all of our missteps and failures, God has placed us in his mission all the same. Yeah. Any other thoughts or comments on the stuff we talked about in this lesson?
I think just kind of springboarding off what John said is that both the 5-talent servant and the 2-talent servant put their respective talents to work. And that's what we need to get out of this parable.
Yeah. To not be the wicked and slothful servant, right?
But
we want to be the good and faithful servant. We want to hear God say, "Well done, good and faithful servant," not "you wicked and slothful servant."
Well, that is the case. In the last case, we will not survive as a congregation. We will go away because if we're not doing what God is wanting us to do in our community, then there's no point in us being there.
And that's exactly what it says in the parable too, right? The master takes those talents away from that wicked and slothful servant and gives them to those that have some already. Yeah.
That's right.
And that's a good point. The guy with the 1 talent, he was complacent and willing to just sit there. And maybe that's not what God had in mind for us or for that servant either. In fact, he punished that servant. We're at least supposed to go forward with what we got, realizing that we have a few limitations, and there's probably a couple turns we ought not take because we're just not skilled in that area. But at least let's go forward in one area, or 2 or 3 or 5, or maybe not every area. Realize your own limitations or something like that.
Good, yeah.
And another interesting thing is that if some new opportunity were to arise, like, for instance, that we would suddenly have 400 children in our church, and we got to cope with this, that same person upstairs who gives us those kids is also going to give us the ability to cope with them, and the talents, and our task is to cope then, but not to bellyache that we don't have the talents, because we will have them when we need them.
Yes, and I think that's a good point, is trust God. Trust that he knows our abilities and knows us better than ourselves. Yes. All right. Well, with that, unless anyone has anything else to say, why don't we go ahead and close? Let's join in prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank and praise you that you have so graciously entrusted us with the task of your kingdom, that you have given us not only abilities and gifts, but you have given us the opportunity to serve you, to worship you, to give thanks to you, to return praise to you because you have given so much. Help us to use these abilities as good stewards. Help us to be servants that it look towards your good will. In your name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Well, again, thanks everyone for coming, and